Seems like we have a heavy UNC side. It's a UNC Duke sort of sorting today. Is it selection or influence? I think that has to be a selection fact. All right. The basic idea of diffusion, right, is this notion that if people start out as different, but they're connected to each other as they move forward in time, they're going to become more similar. This is this notion of a peer influence process, that if I'm connected to you, I somehow take on your behaviors. And the mechanism of that, there's lots of different mechanisms we're going to talk about. And this is an old line of research. It's one of the first things that got people into thinking about networks or why they might think it matters. They figured that there's a reason that we're connected to each other and that if we talk about things and do things, it influences one another. And the most famous, probably early study is the Coleman-Katz and Menzel paper, which looked at the spread of tetracycline amongst physicians in a small community. And what they discovered is if you look at the introduction after the release of the drug, they gave it a false name for some reason. They started, and they moved it forward over time. You see that the most popular people took it first, and then the next most popular people, and the next most popular people. And they inferred from this idea that there was an association between an influence process, that essentially the popular, well-respected doctors introduced it first, and the behavior spread to everyone else. In what might be an archetypical story of this line of research, people have since reanalyzed this data and said, well, it's not entirely true that that could be the case. It might be that there was a distinction in who received it from drug company people and so forth. So the ambiguity around the initial finding characterizes the rest of the field. But we see this in lots of other kind of places, right? So we can think about things like binge drinking. Is it the case that that binge drinking is predicted by friends binge drinking? And so we can think of friends of a partner or the effects of friends otherwise. And effectively, the most common result of this is there's some kind of a positive association. Whether that association is causal, of course, becomes another question entirely. We also might think about whether or not these kinds of things end up affecting things like depression or something or some other set. So is it the case that I'm engaged with others, and in the process of doing that, then my peers' depression level drives things for myself. I'm trying to remember exactly what this finding was. This is the problem with not reviewing my first slides. Oh yeah, this is David Schaefer's paper. David, are you in the room? He didn't make it here yet today. This is why I put this in, because David's going to talk to us. He showed up last night. So this is actually what's known as an actor-oriented model, and so this is a turnover effect where you can think about the ways in which peers and selection and influence happen multiple times simultaneously. So let's start with the simplest diffusion model. There's those in the epi room can take a nap for a moment because these are sort of well-known models. The classic sort of world for epidemiology are these things called compartmental models. And the simplest compartmental model is you have two types of people in the world, right? You have those who are susceptible to a bug and those who are infected. And there's some process, if we're mixing together, where one transitions from being susceptible to infected, and that's governed by a probability parameter, right? And then if I'm infected, there's some feedback process where I may become susceptible again or not. And so if it is possible to become susceptible again, then this is known as an SIS model, a susceptible, infected, susceptible model. And the beautiful of thing about these models is that you have really clear sort of processes by the way this works. And every element of this stage of the population is just broken up into these different kinds of compartments. And you can have much more complex compartmental models. So we can have, in this case, a susceptible. We have an exposed but not yet infectious. We have infectious. We have recovered, right? And we may or may not get resistance. So if we get resistance, we might be moved from the population and not be moving back forth. So this can be very complicated. In fact, you can have, if you would like, stages for becoming a zombie, right? And so one of my favorite compartmental models is the zombie model, in which it shows that, frankly, the zombies will, in fact, take over the world because the movement out to recover tends to be really, really, really low, right? Now, the beauty of these kinds of models, right, is that you can write down exactly what the probability functions are to move from one step to the next, and so then you can integrate those and figure out what the change in the number of infections might be, or the change in the number of susceptibles might be. And this becomes a simple equation as a function of the proportion of people at any given time that are susceptible and the population size, right? So you can write these down in closed form. You can estimate them quickly. You know exactly what they are. For them to work, you have to have an assumption that these mixing is happening, that the mixing probability between the elements of your compartments are in fact correct, right? The mixing probability accurately describes the population. And the key element of network research is that's rarely the case, right? So if your network doesn't have a lot of randomness into it, then it doesn't make sense to sort of treat this network as if it looks like this network. Right? Now this comes with something of a caveat, because the beauty of these compartmental models is that if I write a compartment that allows me to essentially identify parts of my network where it's random within that compartment, I can literally specify the movement between those using the same kind of model. So these things, these compartmental models, actually perform in many cases better than they should. Right? I mean, they're remarkably good first-order approximations to what we expect, and they tend to just miss the, especially if you have relatively high transmission rates, or you have a lot of density within clusters and a well-specified structure between clusters. This can actually do a pretty nice job. When it fails is when the networks are sparse, when there's not really good connectivity amongst the sets, when you can't assume random structure either inside the group or between the groups, or when the probability of transmission is really low, and so that the likelihood of moving from one side to the next can be very idiosyncratic on elements. John?
Could you speak just a little bit more about the importance of randomness? Why is randomness such a key element?
Yeah, because the beauty of randomness is that it allows you to treat this transition probability from one to the next as essentially uniform across all elements of this set. Right, and so if the probability of a susceptible moving to being susceptible and becoming a zombie is a random sort of set, everyone has an equal chance. Then this probability becomes equally applicable across all sets, so that it's a true probability, right? I have an equal chance. I have the same chance that the person next to me in the susceptible box does. And if the network has a lot of randomness to it, it essentially has that feature. Right, and you can imagine a lot of networks where there's some structure, and if you remove that structure, what's left over is enough randomness to act as if, right? And so you can think of the randomness that's left over in the network as just like this kind of compartmental model, only on lower probability, because there's fewer random ties left, and then you have to figure out what to do with the structured ties on top of it. As it turns out, this afternoon we're going to spend a lot of time talking about random networks, so we'll get there. Yeah, please.
I have background in system dynamics, so this looks a lot like
yes.
System dynamics output to me. So I'm thinking about the mechanism for network diffusion. Maybe I'm hearing this wrong, but it's about modifying the transmission constant or the infection constant
right.
using network features.
Usually it's about modifying the connectivity set and holding constant the transmission probability. So it might be that the biology of HIV, for example, we know that the probability for any given sex act of a transmission from an infected to a susceptible is known from the biologist. We know exactly what that probability is, and that probability is constant across all of those types of sets. What differs is the amount of exposure you have by what's upstream and what's downstream of the network. So if you think about the original reproductive rate equation, it's the probability of infection times contact times the duration of infection. It's the contact thing that in these compartmental models is treated as uniform, and the network is treated as specific. It's pairwise difference in who's exposed to who.
So I am totally not a public health person. I apologize.
No.
This is all, the language is all old hat to you all. Does it make sense if I say it in terms of stocks and flows? So
Yes, yeah.
Is it the stocks or is it the flows that we're talking about?
It's the channels for the flows.
Okay.
Right? And so the thing that makes networks unique, usually, is that the channels for the, because you can't assume that without looking at the network itself, you can't assume that those channels are uniformly distributed across the population, but are specific to different types of people. And so this might become a bit more clear in a moment, so hold on. But again, the systems dynamic world and these kinds of compartmental models are very similar in the sense that you set up what the stages of a process are. And so long as you can say that I'm susceptible, I transition to zombies every time I get bitten by a zombie, and the transition to recovered is 0, right? And so that kind of a feature makes this equation actually really easy to estimate, right? And so those kinds of features, so long as you can specify those things, you can do these models really well. And this is why this works exceedingly well for the flu, right? The flu is a great model for this because essentially the flu has a high transmission probability, and a weak contact is sufficient for me to give the bug to you. If someone in here starts coughing, this is why I tell all my students, like every semester, all the time, if if you're sick, go home, I'll get you the notes, right? It's like, it is not worth me getting sick for you coming to school, right? And I love you to death, and I hope you get better, but stay the hell out of here, right? And this is the feature, because it's so easy to transmit if I shake your hand, or someone doesn't wash their hand, or whatever. But for most of the things we care about for networks, like STDs, it's really hard, or Ebola, it's really hard to transmit these things by coughing in the room, right? You have to have some kind of intimate contact, and that intimate contact makes this random mixing assumption between the sets probably wrong. Right? And so what we do instead is we think about a diffusion process as set up as a probability feature. So we might start with one particular node, and then we imagine the probability of transmission from one node to the next as being some feature which I'm going to refer to throughout the day as Pij. And Pij is the probability that a person who has the bug passes it on to someone who doesn't have the bug, right? And if that probability is low, then at each time sort of moment in the network, the probability to get translated to the next person is low, and if that probability is high, then that curve is really high. Now, the reason I say these are probabilities is this isn't like electricity. It's not like it's going necessarily to move across the set. And so there's going to be randomness built into this. So if I start with that exact same starting node, and I have set my probability that says at time A, I look at my neighbors, I pick them with a 0.01 chance of them getting the bug if I have it and they don't. I do that random draw step after step after step for all my peers, right? This has a really low chance or a really high chance, and you get some variability, right? So understanding that variability is often interesting. But it turns out that the shape of these curves, given any sort of feature of the probability level, is a function of some part of the structure of the network, which is what we want to talk about next. All right. So I like to break network diffusion into two parts. One is this topology of the network, sort of the things about the structure, and the second is about the timing of the network, the dynamics. And so that's the way we're going to work this today. On the topology set, there are 5 key elements that drive diffusion on a network. The first is reachability and distance. Right? So we talked about those the first day. And so you can imagine if this is a probability, a coin flip, then the probability of it moving out from me to my partner to my next partner, so 2 steps, is the coin flip times itself. So you square it. If I want to go out 3 steps, I cube it. If I want to go 4 steps, right? So if I have a single chain for me that goes out 6 steps, the probability of it reaching out 6 steps is that probability raised to the 6th power, because it has to be and each time, right? And so that's why distance ends up making it hard for things to move over. So it's really, if you think about something like HIV, where the probability of transmission is less than 1 in 1,000 for any given sex act, the likelihood that it could spread out to thousands of people on a long distance should be incredibly hard, right? This is actually the mystery of HIV for network researchers. How does a bug that's this hard to transmit become endemic? And it's because distance isn't the only feature that drives these types of outcomes. Now, if you think about the other feature that might drive it, is this notion of local clustering, right? And so if you imagine the world's most efficient network, right, where if I want to get a message to you, I don't want you to talk to anyone else. This is an old style rural telephone tree. Did you guys make this familiar? It's like my mother always had a list on the refrigerator of the 5 people she was supposed to call if the aliens invaded, right? And so and those people had a list of 5 people they were supposed to call, but they weren't on the list of my mom's list, right? And so those kind of telephone trees are perfectly efficient because they spread out without any redundancy. In real life networks, what happens is my friends tend to be friends with each other, and so some of the signal that I might pump into this person gets sent off to the other person who's already connected. So there's an inefficiency in the spread structure. And the more local clustering you have, the less likely you are to reach people quickly. Effectively, what this is doing is that's taking this distance piece and saying some of the steps that could be taken through are out. So on the one hand, what local clustering does is it lowers the likelihood that you reach many people quickly. On the other hand, if the probability of transmission is really low, it creates these local redundancies, right? So so if this link fails and this one happens, then it's possible that I can go the other direction. Right? So these local clusterings create redundancies that make it possible for the local cluster to hit up. And this is one of the answers to why HIV works in sort of male men who have sex with men populations faster than it does in heterosexual populations, because in men who have sex in MSM networks, you have closed triangles. You have the possibility of closed triangles. Whereas in purely heterosexual networks, you don't have those closed triangles, and so you don't get that redundancy. The final notion is that it builds on that at the local level is the global redundancy that we talked about the first day, right? So if you imagine this distance problem we talked about before on a single path, the real, of course, is that that's an AND operation on a probability. If you have multiple paths, you get OR probabilities on that set, right? So like if I have two paths and one of these breaks, I have the opportunity to go the other way. And so it's the probability of going down path 1 or path 2 minus the probability of going down both of them, right? And so you can figure this out. If you have lots of redundancy, then you can get long distances without having to, even if the probability of transmission is really low. And the kind of redundancy that we've been focusing on in our research team that we think matters a lot is this idea of structural cohesion that we talked on the first day. If you think about a network, there are independent paths that connect one side of the network to the other, and you can map those with point connectivity. And so in this particular example, remember, it's the case that in this particular case, there's a single cut node, and in this case, there's not. So here you have multiple routes, and that puts everyone at the system at risk in the case that it's not here. Here, if you know there are cut points, you can identify them and remove them. This is going back to the Colorado Springs data we talked about the first day. This is the distinction between the people who have sex with each other and the people who do drugs with each other, right? Needle sharing in Colorado Springs, and I suspect in other places, tends to be a collective activity. And so you get these really dense clusters. There are lots and lots of alternate routes within these clusters. And so the reason that HIV spreads faster in needle exchange networks is twofold. One, of course, you're breaking the skin-blood barrier, right? You're actually putting something into your blood directly. So the transmission probability goes up. But the structure of the transmission network is also much more redundant. And so if a transmission failure happens in one case, you're more likely to get a spread on the other. The final element that we think has plays an important role in network transmission is this notion of star players. And this has been driven largely by the scale-free literature we talked about, is that if there are hubs in your network, those will become the opportunity for super spreading, that they have lots of contacts, so if they get the bug and go lots of places. There are also opportunities for breaking the network apart. And so if you can identify where those folks are and get them to wear condoms all the time or get them to do something like that, they will break up your network. And this tends to be a feature that taps into a process we've understood for a long time, which is the assortativeness of the, oh please, in the back? Yeah. I hadn't thought about it, but we can. No, that's perfectly great. We are going to talk about interventions tomorrow, and I can tell you the ones that I'm aware of. If you have a site of any of those things that are doing that, send it to me, and that'd be fun to talk about. Please.
This is kind of assuming that, or is assuming that everyone has an equal susceptibility.
Yes.
Right. But there are cases of infectious disease or behaviors or something where people are especially resistant.
Right.
And they could function like the opposite of a star spreader. They're breaking up the network in their place, or where they're discovered.
Right, right. So what you're pointing out is that we're thinking about all these processes in isolation. So what's the all else constant? What do these features happen in the real world? All else is never constant, right? And so and one of the things that we're going to talk about when we get to the simulation set is that you often have to make a trade-off between realism and formalism in these pieces. And so when we do disease models of HIV, like Giovanna and a few of us have done, there we really want to map the probability of transmission that matches on to the types of exchanges that are engaged there. So if it's receptive or insertive or whatever, you have different probabilities of transmissions. We have different probabilities of using what have you. Now the question, it turns out, of course, is if you have some sort of a natural resistance, like to the Ebola case, we don't know yet whether or not we can treat that as randomly distributed in the population or some other kind of function that's not random in the population. Intuitively, I don't have a reason to suspect that people who are biologically resistant to Ebola occupy a particularly central person, would have a reason to be central or peripheral in the network, right? If there's something you can do to inoculate people to make them more or less resistant, then that's great. And so there's a lot of work done on what's known as herd immunity. And so who do you have to tap in this network to give a vaccine to stop the spread to everyone else? And ideally, you want to tap these folks that have the potential to be super spreaders, right? Now that's often really hard to find, right? And so you want to think instead often about what's the amount of people that you can connect. Just a quick point on this is what I mean by assortative and disassortative. Assortative networks are networks where people who have small number of ties are connected to other people who have small number of ties, whereas those who have lots of ties are connected to people who have lots of ties. In an assortative network, you tend to get these high-level core periphery structures. And these high-level core periphery structures tend to be really great for spreading a disease widely, but not very quickly. Whereas in a disassortative network, you get a rapid transmission to lots of people, but it doesn't often go as far. The main reason is not because of what you see in front of you, but because there's so many people out here who are left out isolated, who are not set up. And you have these cut points, so if it's possible for the thing to break, it falls apart. Go ahead.
So is this the same set of principles that you use when you're thinking about diffusion of ideas and not just
Yes. It's the same set of principles for the flow over the network. It's a different set of principles for the exchange across the tie. The reason we start with biological diffusion is the exchange process is so clear. Right here we know that it's literally just a binary probability, a certain weighted coin flip to go from one edge to the other, and then that allows us to more easily focus on the structure. For ideas, it tends to be a negotiation, and what the function of that negotiation looks like, whether it's an equal weighting or whether it depends on our joint neighbors or whatever, is open for debate. We're going to get to exactly that distinction. All right. So we can think about how each of these 5 elements might interact. Oh, there's another key point I want to point out, is there is another assumption built into the star spreader idea, which is that these are kind of like beacons that are on, right? And that all your partners are equally exposed to you at each given time set. That's a really bad assumption as degree gets really high in human networks, because we don't have time to talk to 100 people on every day, right? And so there tends to be scheduling limits to the extent to which this is true. Right? Please.
Could you say the difference between star spreaders and people who are bridges between?
Yeah, so I don't know if we have a good example here. So in a network like this, for example, it might be the case that we have nodes that have lots of edges, and those become what we refer to as star spreaders. Whereas a bridge, this could be a bridge, for example, that connects one cluster to another, even though they don't have a high number of partners themselves. Right, so in this case, it becomes crucial for the continuation of a disease or a flow from one part of the network to the next, but it's not necessary that they have lots of ties themselves.
Is a star spreader more of like a local sort of, I guess, is it, I'm trying to think of between a centrality of that person? Is that like?
Right, so the basic idea would be that a star spreader, we would assume, would have high closeness centrality and high degree centrality, but maybe not high betweenness centrality, where bridges, by definition, have high betweenness centrality.
Have you found, for the star spreaders, have you found kind of a maximum reach at which they stop?
A maximum degree?
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't know that empirically. I think certainly in the biological set, there's some good evidence to suggest that there's just a scheduling issue. I mean, how many people can you infect potentially on any given day? That ends up being relatively small. On the other hand, if you have, I really don't think we have enough empirical information. But Rachel?
So this is sort of technical, but if we're thinking about identifying bridges within a global network like that and using something like betweenness centrality, is that necessarily appropriate given that betweenness relies on the geodesic and you can't assume that infections choose the shortest path?
Yes and no. As a definition of a bridge, it's a good option because it allows you to see, essentially, it defines in a quick way which one's on who's connecting a cluster that might be on the other side or not. As a cardinal ordering of who's at highest risk for transmission from one group to the not, probably not. Instead, the ideal would be something like random walk betweenness. And so instead of using geodesics, I use the random walks on the network, and I can see who's there. It turns out that we don't have to actually do the random walk calculation that way. Instead, what we can use the betweenness to get the structural position and something like structural cohesion to figure out who's on multiple routes across the set. Right? And these things tend to be trade-offs. Please.
I think on your next slide you had the assortative and the disassortative, and said that the assortative is more likely to lead to a high core periphery structure.
Right.
So I guess, can you say that again? Because it seems like in the disassortative I see like the individuals who are in the core and the periphery, but is that just because it's core periphery is always global?
Yeah, essentially you're more likely to get a single core here, where you have a single sort of, you can imagine sort of a landscape of the degree distribution. If you have really high degree nodes tied to somewhat high degree nodes, tied to less high degree nodes, and so forth, and it creates this general cone, if you will, from a center to a periphery. Whereas in a disassortative network, you have these local little mountains, and then long chains between them, right? And so those long chains make it less likely to move forward. In a small example like this, I've sort of overclustered the stars, if you will. Please.
Could you apply the
Yes, you could, we'll get to the timing sort in a second, or not in a second, in a little bit. But the structure has to be relative to the time span of the bug, right? So if you have a really long infectious disease, something like HIV, then the issue is there that oftentimes these relations are dropping out in time, and so you really need to take timing into order. If I have something that spreads much faster, then timing might be less important. but it's always relative to the disease set. So these are I'm deliberately bracketing all of these like disease-specific processes, but they will get mapped onto these sets. Please.
Maybe I missed this, but is there a way we can weight the ties, like according to like exposure,
Yes.
duration?
Right. So what you would do is, in fact, this is part of the simulation package we're building for doing network. It turns out that when you get to networks like this, it's better to have simulations than it is because of all these pieces, they get complicated. You can imagine that there's a certain weight to the number of, say, the number of times we have sex per month or something in the relation to the number of times we're in a meeting together. That creates an opportunity, and that opportunity structure will be higher than for someone that has less. And so you can essentially get that many more coin flips, right, to try to pass a bug across that relation. All right. So we just took these. Ashton Verderi and I, who's currently at Penn State, took these 5 elements and essentially put them in a horse race with each other. And just did a simulation and said, well, if we can measure all these things independently, and we have some schools where we have certain kinds of structures and other kinds of schools we have other types of structures, this is using the ad health data, let's just simulate a network diffusion process. We'll randomly pick some start nodes, we'll let it run through, and then we'll compare the speed of diffusion in one setting to the other. When you do that, what you do is you start off with a single infected nodes, you have a probability distribution, you let time run, and you get curves that look like this. And in some settings, right, you get some runs, you get rapid, you get like nothing happens, it sort of trickles along on the edges, and then it takes off at the set. Other side, it takes off immediately, but you get some kind of a median curve here. And you can compare that to what you would see in a similar random network, right? So if you have a random network that has the same degree distributions, everybody has the same number of ties, you get a certain speed of spread, and you get the observed speed of spread, which will be somewhat different. And the area under this curve over the area under this curve gives you a ratio, sort of a speed of how the sort of the structural diffusion potential in this network. If these things are very close, then essentially the diffusion in this network would spread much faster than if they're very far apart, where it happens slowly. And so when you do this, you sort of find the kinds of things you might expect. If you have a lot of local clustering, that tends to decrease the speed at which a bug passes through. If you have grade homophily or peer group strength, as sort of these higher level clustering orders, they also tend to lower the overall spread, because what happens is the bug gets trapped in those little local pieces. And you got some basic size of sets, which I'm going to just ignore for now. We can work this through on some other features. What's kind of nice for us is that it turns out that these kinds of local level clustering still has the effect we expect, but the global level clustering is really a proxy for what's going on at the structural cohesion level, these number of different routes and paths that are there. And that interaction is hard to read from the coefficients, since it's easier to see here, is that if you have essentially lots of really sort of sparse networks where there's not lots of redundancy, then the effective distance is strongly negative. But if you have lots of redundancy, then it essentially makes up this effective distance. And so this is just really just demonstrating in simulation what we pointed out in that first slide about multiple routes. And so if you have these trade-offs between these pieces, you can get different types of spreads in these different elements, which is just kind of fun. All right. If we care then about this idea of connectivity, if that's the first element we care about for network diffusion, we might want to know what the types of how connectivity works in some kinds of settings. And this is some work that I've done with Jimmy Adams and Martina Morris, where we imagine what an archetypical sort of heterosexual network might look like in a general population. In the general population, you can imagine worlds where people have no strong tie, no long tails. So most people have 1 or 2 partners. A few people have a small number of partners. In those kinds of distributions, you get networks that look like this. You get very low connectivity, and it's really hard for a disease to move. But what's interesting is that if you move across the degree distribution, if you just shift a few people from having 1 tie to having 2 ties, and a few people from having 2 ties to having 3 ties, you can get a rapid difference in the overall connectivity of the network, and you still get these dendrils on the edge, but you start to see this core forming in the middle. And this is a key element of networks, which is that if there's, again, come on, wake up. You're hurting my flow here. There we are. If you have networks, I'm telling you, you can imagine characterizing a network by the average number of partners people have. And if you take those 4 networks that I just showed you, they're actually really similar in terms of the average degree. So you move from about 1.65 to about 1.8. And that's not a huge difference in the average number of ties in the population. But if you then look at what happens to the size of the connected component in this network, you get this rapid phase shift, right? And this is something that's characteristic of all networks, which is that, well, almost all networks, is that there's often very rapid differences between disconnected and connected. And oftentimes you can't know what they are. But if you're well above that threshold or well below this threshold, you know you're disconnected or you know you're connected. John?
Is this characterizing, in essence, kind of the worst case scenario? Because, for instance, we're talking about the possible movement of sex partners. I mean, that's going to be
Yes.
focused in population.
Right. So this is for any kind of spread. Remember, the first necessity for something to spread across the network is that they be connected. And if your network is broken up into lots of different pieces, the biggest possible disease outbreak you could ever get could never get bigger than the pieces that are disconnected here. Whereas over here, right, I have at least the potential for the disease to spread widely. Right. And more so the larger the size of this bi-connected component, that's the element, the size of the amount of redundancy in the network. Now, if you then decide, well, come on, Moody, it doesn't make any sense to think that nobody has lots of partners, we can also do the same thing where we add a long-tailed distribution. So now some of our partners, some of our people in our population have a long tail, but we still can imagine that the average stays about the same. And in that case, what you see is that you still get this rapid takeoff. It happens much earlier, right? So at a much lower degree on average, you get the component sizes start to take off, but it does so much slower. And this is part of what that assortativity effect is that the spread starts faster, but it reaches fewer people ultimately in the end. And you can think about this in lots of different ways. I have some slides here to talk through them, some different ways in which you might explore this shape. I'm going to skip over those relatively quickly today, just in the interest of time. They are fun graphics, but they're eye candy, so we'll just go past them. So this is what a really sort of a network where you have sort of an odd distribution. The vast majority of people have only one tie, but a few people have sort of star spreaders. In that kind of world, you get a small reconnected core, and most people are sort of safe over in this blue area. But this kind of region really spreads out quickly. I shouldn't have added. I should never do animations on this travel laptop. Yeah, I'm not even going to talk about it. One of the things that's nice is you can characterize this whole field of distributions by the volume or essentially the inequality in degrees, whether you have really long tails or really short tails. And it turns out that for any given level of average volume in the network, you get very different risk profiles. And what we've been thinking about in this region is that if you imagine a treatment program where you're trying to stop the core spreaders from your high-degree nodes from engaging in this activity, so you're going to arrest commercial sex workers or some such. In that case, what you're doing is you're shortening the tail, but if you're not also simultaneously lowering the volume, you might make things worse, right? Because what you've done is you've now spread that same demand across more people and created more multiple routes. So you need to think very carefully about policy interventions in terms of what kinds of that they might do to these kinds of features in the network. All right. So that was all about topology. That was the world's fastest networks spread on the overview. The goal is to give you a flavor of these sets. Now let's spend a little bit of time thinking about timing. Once you make networks dynamic, the intuition here is really easy, right? It's like I can't get a disease from my partner's future partners. I can only get a disease from my partner's past partners, right? So other than the heartbreak that comes when she leaves me and goes off to somebody else, right, it's not an issue for me from a disease standpoint. But everyone that she's been with before, that's an issue, and I have to worry about that. And so this simple idea that your mother told you that you've slept with everyone who your partner's ever slept with before, right? That idea is the thing that breaks up an observed network into a transmission network. And so I like to distinguish 3 different types of networks on the same set of nodes. We have the contact network, which is the edgeless, the people who connect to each other. We have the exposure network. We have the set of people for which it would be possible, if I started with a bug with one person, for it to reach someone else in time. And so you can think of the sequence of time. And then on top of this exposure network, there's a random probability process that would create a transmission from one set to the X, or the overall size of the risk. To make this a little more concrete, imagine I have a simple little network, right? In this case, we have person A has sex with person C, person D, and person B. This happens at time 2, this happens at time 3, this happens at time 4, right? So these are the timings on top of the edges. For the purposes of convenience, I've just said these are spells, the first spell, third spell, second spell, and treat them as distinct, right? In reality, you can use start and end times. It has the same effect. So if this is the case, what you'll notice is that it's possible for A, if A has an infection, A can pass it to D, but the infection that started at A couldn't make it to E, right? Because this relationship happened at time 1, which is before this one. So this relationship ended before this one started, and so the disease runs into a dead end here, all right? Whereas in this case, this starts at time 2, later at time 3, later at time 4, later at time 6, right? So A could reach all the way out here to O in the sequence of timing. Notice not through the shortest path, right? The shortest path would be going across the B and L link, and that one ended first, but this little local redundancy happens later, and so that makes it possible for this to occur out here. So the actual exposure network in this set from A, which is also, Martina Morris returns to these as the forward reachable path from A, tends to be a much smaller subset than the overall graph as a whole. Right, and this is good news, right? This is what timing does in relations. Timing breaks up an observed contact network into these chunks where it's possible for a disease to flow or not. And then we can ask, well, what's the probability that it would actually make it down these 6 steps? Well, that depends on the transmission probability, the susceptibility, and the activities, and so forth. But we know that the overall risk in this network is going to be constrained by the arrangement of timing. Now, this is actually a really important point, and it feeds into this idea that's come up in a lot of work, which is called concurrency. And so a concurrent relationship is a relationship where the start time of the second edge is less than or equal to the end time of the first edge. Right. What does that mean? It's easier to see it in a picture. It means your relationships overlap in time. It means I don't let go of my last partner until I'm certain of my next partner. Right? It's sort of playing this insurance game is a really bad idea from a disease standpoint, because what it does is it creates these kinds of overlaps in time. And so in this case, we see that these relationships are A and B is concurrent with B and C because they overlap between times at time 2, whereas C and E are overlapping at time 6 and 7, or time 6, right? This overlap is what we refer to as concurrency. Now, why do we care about concurrency? If you think about networks where there is no concurrency, what happens is when a relationship is out of sequence, it creates a bottleneck. It creates a point where it's no longer possible for the disease to move forward. So this happens at time 1, then at time 3, and then it can't go any further. This happens at time 1, and this happens at time 3. It can't go backwards in this set. So you get these little bottlenecks in the transmission sequence that makes it impossible for the disease to move for whatever good is there to move forward. When you have concurrency, and what that forces, excuse me, is asymmetry in the exposure graph. And so from any given node, you have this asymmetric in time exposure graph forward. But when you have symmetry, when you have concurrency, that creates symmetry in the exposure graph. So if here, this is first, this is second, that could go through the 2-step loop. If these overlap in time, it's possible for both of these things to go forward to each other. And that's the fundamental difference of concurrency. What it does is it creates these switches where it used to be a bottleneck, and it opens it up to both directions. And so now everything downstream from A, in A's future relations, who never would have been at risk to anything from C before, is now at risk to everything that happened in C prior to C's reaching A. Right? And so it opens up these switching points for things to move forward in time. It turns out that this is a huge effect on the overall exposure potential in a network. Consider a network, a simple 8-node ring. In this case, all relations are happening at the same time. There are red relations. In that case, the exposure graph is fully connected. I can reach everyone either clockwise or counterclockwise. In fact, there are 2 routes that I can reach everyone in the network. So define reachability as the proportion of pairs that could be reached in time in this case, and you see it's perfect, right? It's possible to reach everyone else. If instead I were to sequence these relationships, right, start at time 1, walk around the clock, go to time 8, you get a very asymmetric reachability pattern, different reachability pattern, and so forth. So it turns out that the exact same contact network with different timing on the edges can change exposure by almost 4 times. right? So are almost double, from a perfect to about half. And this is really important, right? So the timing of the edges alone, that's the only thing that changed, right? The context structure didn't change, it's just the sequencing of relations, and that then changes who can reach who in the network. And also, for those of us that are geeky network types, it changes some of your sort of standard ways of thinking about distances in networks. And so we expect shortest paths to accumulate. So if A is the shortest distance from A to D is 3, and the shortest distance from D to E is 1, then we would expect that to be, it's two steps. It turns out that that's not always the case, right? So in this case, the shortest, from A to C are 2 steps apart. Here, D to E is 1 step. We would expect the distance from A to E to be 3 steps, but in fact, A can't reach E through this path because of timing. You only reach it through this path, which is longer. So the notion of a geodesic distance takes on a whole different meaning in this case because the timing constrains who can reach who over time and which paths are open to the spread. It also, of course, opens a whole series of questions we can ask, which I think are great, that we're not going to get into about new measures, like instead of the shortest path, what's the fastest path, what's the longest duration path, and so forth. And there's a lot of good work people can do in that direction. I'm going to beat this horse a little bit. So the other key thing to remember is that concurrency is a system-level feature. It's not it's an individual-level act that has system-level outcomes. So again, imagine a world where all edges are concurrent, right? Everyone's overlapping in time. In that case, everyone's reachable to everyone else. Now let's just take that one bridging tie and make that happen at a different time. Right? If I do that, then a whole chunk of this network becomes not exposed to each other. It's a safer overall set, even though only one partnership changed its real pattern. Right? That kind of a feature, right, means that the overall network features could be very sensitive to the activities of a small number of nodes, which really confounds the kinds of things that we typically do in public health, where we go out and we collect a bunch of data on what individuals are doing and see what their risk is. Right? That doesn't help us so much here, because most of these people might be behaving perfectly the same, no change at all, but their exposure risk has changed because of what's happened upstream in the network. This is a simulation result I'm not going to talk about. All right, so there's a bunch of things that we can play with here that are fun that I'm just don't have. Peter, did you guys ever do that timed centrality paper?
Yeah, we did.
Awesome. So one thing you can do is once you've measured different types of paths, like quickest path, fastest path, longest path, earliest, what have you, that defines a new path structure in the network. Centrality measures are built on path structures. You now have an entire new class of centrality measures you can open, as if we didn't have enough to start with. But these are great, right? These help us think about new ways that respect dynamics. So we've talked thus far about topology. We've talked about timing. One would assume that these things interact. And so we've been doing some work recently on asking whether or not it's possible for the timing effects to be more or less important in some settings or not, in partial response to some of these findings that we see in the literature, that there are places with low concurrency but lots of disease, and other places with high concurrency and no disease. What might be driving that? Well, what we do is we just end up generating, we take a simulation approach to this and say, let's imagine that we take a bunch of real networks and we manipulate experimentally the timing on the edges, calculate the exposure risk, and see whether or not that exposure risk differs from networks of different structures or not. I go back to my favorite exposure structural feature, which is this structural cohesion measure. Some networks are very sparse, right, that have a small number of independent paths between them. Others have lots more redundancy. And so this average K level is what we're referring to as our connectivity of the network. Take 4 real-world networks and then drop onto this a disease, a timing. So we add a timing to this, and then calculate that exposure, the size of the exposure graph, and then essentially see whether or not there's any association between the structure of the graph and the overall reachability given timing. And it turns out that it has a really strong effect. Right? So there are some settings where concurrency has a really strong effect on return. So if you have a little change in concurrency, you get a rapid change in the exposure risk. Other settings, not so much. Right up here, I get an initial return to concurrency, but then it flattens out immediately. You'll notice that it flattens out at the top, right? And that's because essentially in these highly redundant networks, I thought I had a slide there. In these highly redundant networks, you end up with no room for concurrency to matter because with this, the structure has created the overall connectivity. This is the best slide to see it. So in this case, where the average cohesion in the network is low, you get strong and regular returns to cohesion. When the average to concurrency, when the average connectivity is really high, it's essentially there's already lots of routes to move through, and so you don't need it. Go ahead. It's a simulated timing, which then allows us to measure the exposure. And so the beauty is, we can, in simulated networks, I can assign a relationship timings and manipulate that directly to get an even distribution of concurrency, which you can't do. We just don't have enough real data to do that in the population. And so we are able to figure out in the network by experimentally manipulating concurrency across all of these settings, we ensure a zero correlation between the structure of the network and the structure of concurrency, and we can thus disentangle the effects. So that's what we're doing here. Now, what's that doing in the real world, right, we have a hard time seeing, right? The problem in the real world is that we just literally don't have enough data on the local structures of concurrencies to figure out whether or not there's a natural correlation between bend central and having more concurrent relations or not. There's the right hand, please.
I was going to ask, what do these simulations assume about the transmission probability?
Nothing.
So
That's the
this
beauty,
stays
yeah.
the same,
No, there's actually no, this is an important point. There is no transmission at all in these simulations. What we've done is we've calculated the set of pairs that could be reached in the network. So we've measured this exposure potential. And I think that that's really nice because the exposure potential is where disease could do. And so the only thing that's going to change on top of that path structure is going to be the probability of infection. And the probability of infection for any infectious disease is going to be higher. The overall extent of disease is always going to be higher when the exposure graph is higher, because that's the path where the disease can actually move. And so at that point, then it doesn't really matter if you have a low. You're going to get an intercept shift on the proportion of people actually reached if you have a low probability of transmission versus a high probability of transmission. But it's always going to be governed by the size of that risk set. All right. Let's shift gears a little bit now. We're going to move to a kind of diffusion that's going to have the same sort of flavor that I have a bit, I pass it on to you if you have the bit. But now that transmission is going to be dependent on our overlapping neighborhoods. This is known as complex diffusion. And so what we've done so far is we've assumed that the risk that a person has of getting the bug is the same if they get 1 unit risk from each node, from 4 different nodes versus say 4 units risk from 1 node. Right? In sexual transmission, that's probably perfectly reasonable because this is just the number of coin flips you get for each person. And if I have the same number of edges, sort of the same number of coin flips given my exposure, it doesn't really matter. If it's an idea, right, it might be that I believe this idea differentially than I believe this idea. In fact, I believe an idea that perhaps I have lots of nodes telling me about as being more veracious or having more veracity than one that I only hear from my crazy uncle, right? And so the thought is that we can imagine this notion of complex diffusion, that I only adopt the behavior if more than one of my neighbors have adopted that behavior. Right? So in this case, these 2 nodes started the behavior. That means that this node adopts it because this node is friends with both of them. And then once these 2 are set, then this node might adopt it because he's friends with both of them. Right? So this complex diffusion set then runs out of gas at this point because even though these 2 are directly connected, for each of these neighbors, it's never the case that 2 or more of his or her partners are going to have the idea. Right? And so this is I like this as a bridge for thinking about social diffusion because it allows us to think of the structural position of the node that's sending as opposed to the difference of the bug itself. The bug probability is exactly like the biological diffusion model, but the structural conditions that allow it to be taken up on the susceptible side are different. Now, one of the interesting things about about complex diffusion is that it really has this bottleneck property. So if you have a network that has lots of local clusters and lots of cut points, there's never a chance for it to move across these cut points. It's always going to get stuck in one little cluster or the other. Because anytime you have an edge that's a bridge from one set to the next, it's impossible for the bug to cross, or for the idea to jump across that set. So this is an example from a collaboration network. Collaboration networks have this structure where you have lots of authors of one paper and then say a single bridge from the other. If I'm only going to adopt a new statistical technique if 2 of my other collaborators do, right, in that case, that would never diffuse through a collaboration network like this because it's too sparse. There's not enough redundancy in the network. In fact, if you were to go through and take all possible pairs of nodes that are connected and seed them as our start nodes across this entire network, the largest diffusion you could ever get is 8 people. Right? And so the structure of overlapping triangles governs the overall extensive reach of complex diffusion. And this is really nice for us because it lets us think about different kinds of settings. And again, this is one of the Prosper schools. Well, you can imagine starting diffusion, a couple of kids start to smoke, then their peers only adopt smoking if at least 2 of their other partners smoke, right? You get this nice spread through the network, but it's conditioned in a way that's much more locally dependent than if I only had a single tie, right? And so it really is required this kind of redundancy for it to work. And we think this is true in a lot of social features, right? So the things, it's not enough for a single one of my friends to pick up something for both of us, for me to adopt it myself. And it has really different diffusion patterns. So what you see, if you look across all of the Prosper schools, all 300 or some of them, do this kind of simulation where you seed 2 nodes and then see how many people it could possibly reach in the network. You get very bimodal distributions. There are some nodes that can be spreaders in this kind of a complex diffusion world and reach lots of people, and others that you don't. Go ahead.
Is there a way of looking at how it is the thing that's being transmitted mutates or changes depending on the structure? Like
yes.
A broken telephone kind of effect?
That's yes. So what you've done is you've now taken you've switched the other variable. So you've, instead of asking what allows this thing to be passed, you said what's going to make this thing, what happens to this thing as it gets passed, right? And there certainly are models for doing that, both in biology, where we look at the mutation, the literal mutation of bugs. I have a great student, Nayland, some of you met her last night, over at UNC, who's looking at putting together HIV epidemic networks from the distance and the mutations of the HIV bug as measured, right? So you can see whether or not 2 people are likely to have had common infectors because our bugs are similar than if we're further apart. Turns out it's really, really hard to do for the wet regions of biology, that the samples get messed up and some other thing like that. But that's a different question, but it's a good question, and it's actually part of what happens when we get to the rest of behavior diffusion. So you can do this process over and over again. You can say, where is it likely that you get complex diffusion that spreads to lots of folks in the network? And again, if you have really sparse network without lots of structural cohesion, it almost never goes anywhere. If you have lots of redundant paths in the network, you're more likely to get a spread. It turns out that the key feature for complex diffusion is the transitivity ratio, the extent to which my friends of friends are friends. You have to have some transitivity, right, for this to take off, otherwise you don't get the overlapping triangles that makes it possible to reach anybody. But if you have too much, then you have closed cliques, and it never goes out past that closed clique. Now, it turns out that you might think, all right, Moody's going off on his simulation bench again, but you can actually do something with these realistically. And so there's a nice set of papers that this team has worked on where they imagine a complex diffusion process governed by a transmission probability and an overlapping threshold model. And then they look at the amount of times that kids have transitioned from smoking to non-smoking over time and fit that as an MLM, right, as a Markov chain model, adjusting the parameters for the exposure and for the threshold to get the best fit. And they do a pretty good job for a very simple 2-variable model. All right. It's not a perfect fit, right, but there's enough there for us to be curious that there might be something we can do with it. All right. I point out complex diffusion because I think it's just the first of what I'm hoping that you guys take off as a whole world of ways of thinking about diffusion in much more interesting ways than just dyadic transmission, which is that the position of the infected and the susceptible in the network somehow condition their likelihood of sending or receiving the good. So it might be that if I'm a central node, I'm confident in my opinions, and I could care less what you think about, and by God, I'm never going to take anything you give to me. On the other hand, it might be that because I'm central, you believe me. So those kinds of differential transmission effects based on the position of the network is something that there's a huge host of these kinds of problems people could think about. And I think people just haven't been very creative in expanding this idea of complex diffusion to other sorts of general node position transmission models. And so I hope you do that. All right, so that's the end of sort of the basic diffusion set. I'm now going to move into classic behavioral peer influence models. Unless there's questions, comments, concerns. Do we need more coffee? Let's take 5 minutes, get up, get some coffee, wake ourselves up, make sure that we're not really bored with Moody up here, and we'll come back again, all right? I steal a little of your time?
Yeah. I actually was just going to ask you, I think I stuck my slides in the same Dropbox directory or at least I did it in the Dropbox directory you gave me
Yes,
access
that would
to.
be it.
So
yep.
I think that's also the same one that you were pointing them all to find these, because it is true that in the back of the room this sucker's small.
Is it hard to see?
It's not hard to see. It's just it's small. It makes it a lot easier if.
Yeah. Let's just go back to the home here.
Sorry, now it's like hoping you'll be able to find where you were in your slides again.
Oh yeah. Wake up. This machine really is a disaster.
Yeah, how old is this sucker?
It's new. It's just weak. I had no business buying a consumer grade machine.
Right.
But I thought, well, it'd be nice to have something that is small, and then I don't have to, carry it around everywhere.
I gotta say, if you're already a Windows guy, although this one of the this one does act like a tablet, doesn't it? It flips back. The Surface Pro ain't bad.
Yeah, and
it's tiny.
I think what's nice about it is that it is tiny. It's small. I can carry it around, and I think half of the.
Yep, that's me.
Right here.
Yeah, the communities one. Duke, SNH.
Oh, there we go. Yes, so I'm going to download it.
Good.
Put it on the.
Well, I can also. I was planning to present off of mine.
Oh, okay,
rather
great.
than off of yours. I just meant that. So good. But you wanted to steal some of my time.
Yeah, perfect.
Also,
awesome.
I just wanted to make sure that when I told them that they could find that in there, that it was actually there.
Awesome. Does this make sense? What I'm saying thus far?
Yeah.
I can never hear myself when I'm down here.
You and I are so two peas in a pod. The style of sort of the fire hose of information, mine is exactly the same way. It's just like, and here's a bunch of slides, and it has a bunch of references, and you can look at the references, and I'm going to give you pointers. And,
exactly.
Sort of see if it hooks you on so many things. But
I'm going to get some more coffee.
Yeah. So I'm feeling very happy.
I know. I had been everything.
Because I'm like.
But yeah.
All right, let's go ahead and pull folks back in before I steal too much of Peter's time. All right, so the main feature that distinguishes, I guess I have a few people out there. The main thing that distinguishes peer influence models from biological diffusion or other sorts of step-by-step diffusion is the bit changes, right? So the key element with behavior is that if I'm influencing you, it's pretty unlikely that you're not influencing me. And so the general model for most peer influences are of some kind of reciprocal effect. And the size of that effect we can specify, we can model the distinctions of it, but that's the key feature, that unlike the biological set, where we expect that the idea is the bug remains largely the same as it moves through the network, for behavior, we fundamentally, the whole basis of the model is that people's behaviors are changing as a function of each other, and so it has to be reciprocal. If I'm affecting you, you probably have to be affecting me. Now, as I'll point out, there are some cases where we can relax that assumption. If my job is to be a hardcore right-wing Republican because I'm chair of the party, right, then I'm not going to change my opinion no matter how much you talk to me, right? And so there are some features that we can build that kind of flexibility into the model, but in general we expect that the underlying model is there's some kind of influence to each other. Now, there's a huge background in this model. It's been working on for a long, long time. The first set of models were really so the story of peer influence. So the first set of these models were largely that I would ask people, do you smoke? How many of your friends smoke? And people would say, most of my friends smoke, right? And so ego would report on alters behaviors. And it turns out that was subject to huge amounts of projection bias. That I assume that my friends all care about networks because when they're with me, they talk about networks, right? And they must therefore care about networks. And so that's led to a huge amounts of overestimates. The next sort of stage of the peer influence literature has moved to where we let egos report their behavior and alter report their own behavior, so we have self-reported behavior, but still cross-sectional. And these models tended to lower the amount of influence we observed by a fair amount, but they were still pretty common. Then we moved to the kind of models we're into now, which is that we have ego behavior at time t as some function of alter behavior at time t minus 1, plus lots of different controls and so forth. Still a lot of room for debate on whether these things work, and the best direction we've moved yet is in this actor-oriented model, which we're going to talk about on Friday morning, Thursday morning? Friday morning, thank you. Finally, the movement away from even the Siena models has been towards experimental models, and we're going to talk a little bit about those as well. Experimental models, you actually determine from the outside whether or not people are related or not. And the classic example is roommates, randomly assigning people to roommates. Turns out there are some deep problems with those as well, because it's not clear if I assign you to somebody you could care less about, if I should expect any kind of effect there. And so those are probably heavily underestimating the treatment effects, but they're clearly exogenous, which is what people are trying to get at. All right. So the classic peer influence model is a two-part model. That model looks something like this. You have some vector of behaviors at time 1, and that's a function of a series of your characteristics, your origins, and so forth. And then at the next time step, my behavior at time t is a function of my prior's behavior and a weight on my peer's behavior. So W is the network. This is the vector of behaviors that people have at the prior time point. And this is your peer influence coefficient. And so what's really nice about this model, let's see if we can put this out here, is that it's a balancing sort of model. So if alpha were equal to 0, this means these things fall out, and it's just my standard regression effect. It says that my behavior is what it is due to my regression. The peers are not there at all. If alpha is equal to 1, then everything's due to my peers, right? And my own behaviors don't matter, and I just do what my peers say that I should do. To give you some, I'm going to walk through a series of examples of how this might work. The key element is this weight matrix. It's the extent to which I value the opinions of my peers. And you can have lots of different specifications of this matrix, right? The most common, by far, is just equal weight. That I treat all my peers as equal, and I work with that. It might be instead that I weight it by the strength of the tie. It could be weighted by reciprocity or something like this. But it's generally done as my peers' behavior. All right. If you look at this model and you have a little bit of background in spatial statistics, this should look exceedingly familiar, right? We actually refer to this as the network autocorrelation model, because what this coefficient is literally the autocorrelation of your behavior with your peer's behavior. If you assume that this dynamic process runs continuously and the network doesn't change, you can get the equilibrium solution is in fact the network autocorrelation regression equation. It works out very nicely. And to get some intuition about how this works, you can imagine walking through some nodes that have different values at time 1, right? So some nodes have a value of 1, other nodes have a value of 7. And at each time step, what happens is I become closer to my peers. So if a node of 1, this node up here has a value of 1. He's tied to someone who has a value of 3. Someone else has a value of 2. I'm going to split the difference and have a value the next time of about 2.5, right? So here I go there, and next, and so forth. And over time, what happens is people become more and more similar. In fact, these models, if you let them run long enough, are going to generate essentially a consensus value. Right? So if the network is connected and everyone has a positive influence effect, the network assumes at equilibrium in the long run that we all come to consensus. This is a problem for the model, right? And as I set that out there, the theoretical set is that we don't expect real people to actually come to consensus on real behaviors. And the reason for that is probably because the model is wrong, right? It's not the case that W is fixed, right? It's not the case that alpha is fixed the same for all people at all times, right? So all these things can change, and so we need to make sure, and it's also not the case that our initial conditions, that our behaviors stay the same. So since we have a lot more moving parts in reality than we do in this model. So we need to keep that in mind. What this model is doing is proposing an idea based on a simplification of the world that we hope is useful, at least in the short run. I find it useful to think through some intuition built on these ideas. And I'm only going to do this really quickly. I have a lot of different examples in the slides. Imagine you have two behaviors going on simultaneously, just because it makes the dynamics a little simple. And at time 1, I randomly distribute them, right? But people are connected in the network based on this kind of 3 groups. And I have 3 colors here. You can't tell it when they're spread out like this. And then over time, we let this influence process occur, right? So time 1, time 2, time 3, time 4. And what happens is people become more similar to their peers, right? So the red group groups together, the green group groups together, the black group groups together. And this is purely starting from a random starting point, right? So it's just the network that's generating that kind of sorting, right? And you can then play with this kind of assumption a lot and get different kinds of mixing and so forth. And if you have different levels of mixing, different levels of influence, you get different levels of coherence amongst the groups. And this is, again, just to build intuition. And I encourage you to go through the slides and play with it. I'm going to skip through it a bit in the interest of time and get to the actual empirical things that we care about. One point to point out, and I think was one of the nicest ways of thinking about these kinds of things, is we might decide that alpha shouldn't be a constant across the entire population. We might say that people have differential susceptibility to peer influence, so this becomes a vector. Now, it turns out that if I have n vectors and n people, this is a really hard model to estimate, right? So I have to, you have to introduce some kind of identification procedure to this. It might be that there are 2 kinds of people in the world, leaders and followers. And that's what I've done in this next set of pieces, right? So in this case, leaders, I have an organizational responsibility to maintain my opinion. And so what that does, though, if I can convince my peers, because they believe me more than anyone else, is it creates an organizational belief space, right, anchored at where these organizational leaders are. Right? And the more I'm tied just to the leader as opposed to someone else in the network, the more my opinion gets spread out. So very simple toy model that says that some people in the world have to hold their positions because their jobs depend on it and other people's don't, can create this kind of diffusion, not a diffusion, this kind of polarization in the population, right? Even if we start at randomly different species. So the point of this, of course, is to think a little bit about what's underlying these models before we move into what's going on in the real world. And we, please.
I have a question. How does that differentiate from previous research that shows that, I guess, popular people are actually more influenced heavily by the people around them to maintain that position?
Yeah, so that model says, if your model was that popular people are more influenced by others around them in order to maintain their position, what you've done is instead of making the alpha low for popular people, you've made the alpha high and lower for others. Right, now, if a person is popular and wants to try to please lots of different people at once, that's going to force them to the middle of all those people, because that's the only place they could find this set. So that model would predict a very fast consensus of leaders to the middle. My guess is we don't see that very often, and so we want to think a little bit about what the global situation of that would be. Right? All right. So you can play with these kind of toy models over and over again. It ends up being the case that the best way to estimate these models, if you actually want to estimate them in real data, is this, and all you have are cross-sectional data, then you're forced to make 2 assumptions. The assumption you have to make is that the world's at equilibrium, that this is the influence process has run its course. and that your weight matrix is fixed over that equilibrium set. Both of those assumptions are wrong, right? But if you have cross-sectional data, that's the best you can do, right? And so then you estimate this equation, which is really just a network autocorrelation model. The beauty is that this measure here, this W times Y, is just the mean of your friends. So you add into the model, as a covariate, the mean on Y of all the alters that ego has in the network. And so this is why the ego network data that we talked about before, why those models actually work. Right? You don't need to take the model takes the whole system. This model looks like it takes the whole system into account, but by virtue of the equilibrium assumption, you've essentially come down to just taking in the average of my peers. Right? And so this is a very nice feature. That means that if all I have are ego network data, and I'm still willing to make this assumption, then I'll get the exact same answer that I would get if I would do it the other way. The one difference is if you have the old network, you don't have to have a very simple error term. Instead, you can have a network-based error term where you allow different elements of the error term to be autocorrelated as well. And so you can distinguish an influence on Y from an influence on your errors. And this is what the linear network autocorrelation model in R, which is a package that RBUTS has, actually does. It lets you specify two different things. So for example, if I'm using the ad health data, I might have a peer effect on friendship, and I might have correlated errors based on the clubs we're both in. All right, so if we share clubs, that means you're exposed to lots of different things that might capture some latent features that I don't have in my data otherwise, but then I can isolate the peer effect from the, I should be very careful here, the peer association from the exposure to common influences through clubs or something. Right? Please.
Sorry if I missed this, but does the weight matrix include friends of friends?
Yeah, so all the weight matrix is...
Does it go all the way out?
Yes.
Or, okay.
So all the weight matrix is a normalized adjacency matrix. So I've taken my adjacent matrix, and the only condition of the weight matrix that's necessary is that all the entries have to be between 0 and 1, and the row sum has to be to 1. Right? Now, it might be that I weight reciprocal ties heavier than asymmetric ties. I might be that I weight them by the number of times we communicate. So there's lots of different functional forms you can do to it. But so long as it has those features, that it sums to 1 across the rows and all the values are between rows, that ensures that Y is well behaved. If W violates that assumption, if you let the row values go greater than 1, Y explodes. Right? So then essentially I can have a value that's greater than, that's outside the range of my peers. And so that's why we make the normalizing assumption. All right, Peter, is it okay if I take 10 minutes to talk about the Christakis and Fowler papers? All right, so those of you that are here for health have probably bumped into these models before. So this is arguably the set of papers that kicked off the Networks and Health general sort of firestorm. And the reason that NIH and so forth has become so interested in thinking about peer effects is in large part due to some of the great sort of evangelical missionary work that Christakis and Fowler have done. They have not, unlike me, learned their lesson about stepping in front of the press. Because the press never gets it right. But that said, just to give, so what I want to do is just quickly is talk through what they did, what some of the complaints are, and where I think we can go next. All right. So just to recap, what they did is they discovered in the Framingham Heart Data Health Study, which was this large community study in Framingham, an untapped network item. And the untapped network item was who would you go to? Who's your emergency contact? And over time, they list lots of people, and these data were collected originally both for health purposes, so if something happens, who we contact, but also for follow-up purposes. So if I'm doing a survey, a longitudinal survey, and I lose you, it's nice to know where your mother is, because your mother probably knows where you are, right? But it also turns out that that's a network built into itself, and so you have different types of relations. You have kinship relations, you have friendship relations, and so forth. And they followed these folks over 32 years, and they started at one sort of weight level, and then over time, people get older, they start eating more donuts for breakfast, and coming to conferences in the South where we have to feed you all the time. And before you know it, right, you have this sort of association where people move from their status, moves from being, the status in this graph changes from, if it's technically obese, you're yellow, if you're not, you're green, and then the size is proportional to BMI. And what they notice when they look at this is that there tends to be this kind of clustering, that people that are heavy are near each other, people that are thin are near each other, and so maybe there's a feature going on. And so what they do is their first step at this model is to look at just the correlation, right? What's the relative increase in my probability of being obese as a function of my partners being, my peers being obese, if my partner's at 1 step from me, 2 steps from me, 3 steps from me, and so forth. And this is the resulting graph they showed, and the fact that these guys here, the confidence intervals are above 0, is what's led to the conclusion you see in the literature all over the time that there's sort of a 3 degrees of influence process going on for obesity. That something happening out 3 steps out might affect my own weight later in time. Now, this actual set is done using a random graph model. So what they do is they compare the correlation observed in the real data to the correlation you would see if you were to randomly commute the data, and they see that it's higher than that. But this is actually not a bad association. I think the association test itself is probably accurate. Whether it means anything causal is where the debate comes in. And so to get at that, what they estimated are a series of equations which are edgewise regressions. And so essentially what this is doing is saying ego's current weight is a sum function of my alter's current weight, controls for alter's previous weight, controls for ego's previous weight, and other sets of controls. Now one of the big problems is, in the JAMA paper, the other sets of controls are exceedingly small. It's just gender and weight, right? So they control for nothing else in the set. They do, and when they do that, what they find is this kind of effect. Now nicely, the alters are subsetted by type of relation, so they don't pool all alters, but you have alters that might be friends, they might be same-sex friends, and so forth. And these are the estimates and confidence intervals. And there's been a lot of hay made out of the fact that mutual friends or ego-perceived friends have a stronger effect than alter-perceived friends. So if you name me as a friend, but I don't reciprocate, that has no effect distinguishable from 0 on my own BMI. Whereas if I name you as a friend, I tend to follow you in your weight behavior, and if we name each other as a friend, even more so. The reason the confidence interval is so large here is that there's not that many mutual friends in these data. Right? Remember, the data, they never asked them who your friends are. They asked who's going to come and help, who's going to find you. So this is really, this is another problem with these data we got to keep in mind. And this is, I see this as actually a positive in their favor, which is they find an effect in data that was never meant for this kind of study. Right? So it's a really weak signal, if you will. But it's there nonetheless. Just to get in our heads what this kind of model looks like, this is what the scatter plot, if you will, would look like if I took 2 people over 3 waves. So in this case, the person orange at wave 1 is thin, gets heavier, and this is their friends, right? And so this kind of regressions have some weird sort of sets to it, right? So you know that the y value has to be constant because the ego's current weight is going to be the same for all alters I'm engaged in, right? So there's some clustering that goes on there. And if you try to fit a single effect to this, you're really pooling lots of simultaneous information that might not be accurate. So instead, they don't do that. They use generalized estimating equations with a random intercept model to allow each individual's curve to differ from someone else's curve, and they estimate the overall set. That's in their favor. That's a nice set. They also do some difference in difference models, and try to look at those in some of the later papers. Also, they find a similar kind of effect. All of these are great, and this is what's led them, I think, to be pretty vociferous about saying, look, even in data that were never collected for this purpose, that we've gone back to that have weak signal, with all the best sets we can do, we tend to find these kinds of results. That hasn't stopped the critiques against them from going extremely vociferous and really strong. And they've turned on essentially the element that's going to bug you in your career if you go down this path for the rest of your life, which is that there's a fundamental distinction between selection and influence. And we can't figure out, and this is really a disciplinary difference. Economists are convinced that this is all selection. Sociologists know that peer influence must happen because they're social creatures, and so I don't care why would I even ask the question? It's obvious, let's just ask how, not whether. And this fight is at the heart of this debate, and it really is a fight between disciplinary perceptions of whether you have an individual's perspective or a community perspective. Frankly, I find this debate about as interesting as nature versus nurture. Right? The answer is yes. Right? Both of these things have to be happening. People select their friends for various reasons, right? I select friends that like to talk about networks because I think the people that don't believe in networks are stupid, right? So I have this predisposition for this movement I move. But it doesn't mean it goes away entirely. It means we need to figure out the best way to, in fact, identify these features. And so there's a whole series of these pieces. There's a question in the far back, yeah? Okay. It's exactly what it is, right. And so all the debates we did in the early 90s about whether or not genetic effects were real using twin studies, It's like, yes, right? But it also turns out that the genetic effects can be magnified or suppressed depending on the social environment, which I think is probably what's happening here. And we see this a lot in the experimental work, especially with some new work Shariq Hassan is doing. So what are the kinds of critiques people have leveled at it? There have been empirical critiques and theoretical critiques. The empirical critiques have said, well, let's take the exact same model that they estimate on something that we know can't be diffused through the network and see if we find a peer effect. So my favorite example is to say, let's take people's acne, right? So we have 2 adolescents from Mad Health. Let's see if the acne of one student predicts the acne of the other. It turns out that you get a positive correlation if you do it unadjusted versus adjusted. It's controlling for some different things. Same thing with friends' headaches. They also do the same thing with height. And they find that you get a correlation that's above 0. And this is the point that Fowler points out later, is that they cheat a little bit, like they use a 0.1 estimate of significance as opposed to a 0.05, and the effect size tend to be pretty small and go even smaller if you adjust for a few controls. Fair enough. Other sorts of critiques have been looking at the difference between what's statistically different from 0 versus statistically different from each other, right? So they make a big deal in their papers about these mutual effects, alter effects, or ego effects versus alter effects. So this is the directionality of each of these findings. And they talk a lot about these 2 effects because they're above 0 and say, well, this is not, and so that's driving the set. But of course, you can't distinguish these 2, right? Their confidence intervals overlap. So I can say that mutual ties are different from 0, but I can't really say that they're different from the other ones. Right? This is just a fundamental feature of statistical confidence intervals. We don't know the difference. My sense is that if I have a repeated experiment over and over and over again where I find the same result consistently, either I have a fundamental model problem that's carrying out, or I have a real signal. Right? And so, we'll think about that. The fundamental model feature, so there's a bunch of these other kinds of sets that go over. And I'm not going to go through those ones in particular because there's a much more damning one. And so the damning problem is this paper that came out by Schalise and Thomas. Schalise is a computer scientist and econometrician who used graphical causal models to try to figure out if these models could be identified. And the thing that he posed is there's some selection feature out here, some latent variable, unobserved, X variable, that might be causing my behavior at time 1 and causing us to have a relationship. If that's the case, I have a backdoor route of causation that invalidates this causal inference of my alters effect on my behavior. And the problem is this is fundamental. Right? There is no sense, if there's anything out here that does this, you can't be certain that this is going to be true. Go ahead.
Isn't that the case with everything?
It is. This is the problem with this model. And thank you for, I didn't plant her, I thank you. Is that there's 2 problems with this model. The first is this model is fundamentally wrong for any kind of model about adjacency. But it also says that if I have a model without adjacency, I've also missed that route, right? And so every model that you do that is your standard model, ignore this, just see where the z affects x. If there's some feature going through here, that's also confounded. And so you end up, what this paper does is it says that and this is largely how he finishes the paper, is that all observational data are useless for making causal inference. Perhaps he's right. It means that we should all go home and become carpet makers or something. But I think we have to do something with the world we have. So there are 2 solutions that you can get to this, and these are and Schalise is right to point them out. One is to say that we might have something, a z variable that perfectly intercepts the latent effect. Right? So I have something that assumes that there's no indirect causal arrow here. That brings us back to identification. Or it might be that I have some other feature that causes the adjacency that intercepts the effect of the latent variable. This is the model people have worked with because what Z becomes is random assignment. So this is the logic behind experimental designs, is if I can assure that I have this, then it doesn't matter what's going on with the latent effect, all of the causal effect that's going on here is being driven by Z. And so essentially this could be true or not, it doesn't matter. So this is a pretty depressing paper when it first came out. People were really worried about it. They weren't sure exactly what to do with it. I think that there's actually a nice middle road out of this. And the middle road is to think about it in 2 steps. One is we can think about that's my favorite Quine quote, but we can think about this as a two-stage modeling process, as what drives selection versus what drives influence. And this is what you can do that in a Heckman style, where you literally model the 2 of them, or you can do it in a simulation style, which is what the Siena models do. And well, so since we're going to talk about that later, I'm not going to talk about that right now. Or you can think about this problem as an instrumental variable problem. And so what happens is we know that there's something that we care about, say a peer influence versus some other thing, which is selection, and they're generally confounded, and so we can't be certain what we have. So if we can identify some instrument, then we can use that to identify y without the confounding with our selection feature. The problem is that fundamentally, whenever instrument you have, you lower your power. So instruments always create weak tests. That's what they're designed to create weak tests. You have to throw away some of this information because it's suspect. And so what I've found to be the best solution are the Siena models. We can think about those as well. But if you're not going to do a Siena model, or you have cross-sectional data, the best choice are sensitivity analyses. And so you can actually go back to the causal diagram that Saligi said. Instead of treating it as binary, you can treat it as valued. And it says, how big would the association be between this latent variable and something else have to be to invalidate my outcome? And there's a great paper. This is this paper by Vanderweel. And what he shows is that if you do these sensitivity analyses with some very reasonable assumptions, the kinds of models about acne, height, and headache fall apart. There's no evidence for them. They're very sensitive to the model specification. But BMI, loneliness, divorce, these kinds of models seem to work quite well. Right? So this is a paper that says with some reasonable assumptions, you can get to some nice answers. And it turns out that Ken Frank at Michigan State has a really nice set of tools that if you want to play with to do some estimations for this. And so these are the ability to imagine that I've estimated a regression coefficient, say its value is 3. I have a standard deviation, or standard error of that of 1.1. I have a sample size. I can say essentially how big of a bias would I have to have in some other variable to make this coefficient not real. And so these are the kinds of things that I like to think about. In this case, if this is what I observed, I would have to invalidate the inference, 28% of the estimate would have to be due to some bias. That is, there would have to be, to invalidate the inference, some omitted variable would have to correlate at 0.202 with the variable I have. And you can ask yourself, is there any variable that is plausible in my world where that would be true? Right? And this is the kind of thing that you can use to try to judge whether or not you have a plausible reason to distrust your model or not. And if your model is really weak, then you're out of luck. But it at least gives you some sense of how strong your findings are. Please.
So you said that we could download this?
Yes. So what's great about Ken's stuff is he has it set up as an Excel sheet. He has it set up as a SAS program. He has it set up as a Stata program. He is like, if you want to do this, he's giving you every way he can do it. And there's now actually an R package for this. So.
Are the links somewhere in the PowerPoint presentation?
Yes. So all of these links are live in the PowerPoint presentation. Thanks. Please.
How much do you think the field is going towards doing two-stage, like style modeling, or IB instead of?
Yeah, there's a disciplinary difference. So the economists are doing independent variables and saying you got to find an instrument, and sometimes you have good instruments. Most of the time you don't. My least favorite, please don't ever use it instrument that economists use are, instead of using the peer effect, I'll use the people who are friends with my friends, but I'm not myself friends with. Right? So then the idea being, well, I've selected my friends, but if there's maybe my peer, my two-stage friends, I didn't select them, so I'm not confounded by them, but they can influence me indirectly through my friends. The problem is there's usually a reason I'm not friends with my friend's friends. Right? This is the ex-girlfriend problem that Facebook has. They keep recommending that my wife makes friends with my ex-girlfriend because we have friends in common. But there's a reason she's not friends with them, right? So that has a negative effect on the peer influence, right? And so I think a lot of times you need to think very carefully about the social mechanisms that are driving the underlying instruments, and most of them are just awful. I think that the two-stage model is actually getting some traction, and we're finding that both in the observed kind of models, but also in experimental models. So this is work I referred to by Sharif Hassan, is asking essentially what's the uptake of the treatment within an experimental assignment. So the fact that I've assigned you to a roommate, and you might think it's exogenous, but if I hate you and I never hang out with you, then essentially that I have an intent to be treated effect as opposed to an actual treatment effect. And you can model the intent to be treated difference. So those are great. If you have, again, if you're doing this in a cross-section, all you can do are try to do the two-stage Henson style. Ideally, you have dynamic models, and then you use these stochastic actual-oriented models, which are the Siena models, which are literally one set of equations that decide how I select friends, another set of equations about how those friends influence my behavior, and they're driven by this utility functions that actors are playing with, which is, well, would I rather start smoking and lose this friend, or stop smoking and find a new friend? And it's a very nice underlying theoretical model. All right, so I've taken way more of Peter's time than I should have. I'm going to stop there. Let's take 5 minutes. We'll do a quick set.